Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening also, depending on where you're connecting from. My name is Darlan Marti. I work at the WTO Market Access Division, and I will be starting today's presentation. You will also be seeing two additional colleagues of mine in the Market Access Division, Roy Santana and Simon Neumüller, who will be continuing after I speak. They will be continuing the presentation. The session is being recorded, as you know, and my recommendation is that once we start, that you keep your microphones muted. If you wish to keep your video on, that's good because we can see you, but of course it uses more bandwidth, so you may wish to cut your video later as well. The topic for today is how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted trade in goods and the role that the WTO has had in monitoring that impact and in monitoring the measures that governments have taken to fight the pandemic. And we will be looking at both the impact and the role of the WTO with a particular focus at trade restricting measures. As you know, during particularly the first phase of the pandemic, governments have taken some measures that have restricted international trade. So we will be speaking to you a little bit about what happened at that point and what the role of the WTO was. As I said, the presentation will be split in three segments. I will start, I'll be followed by Roy, and then my colleague Simon will finish the presentation. We will speak for about 30 minutes and without interruption. And at that point, we will stop and we'll be collecting questions and hopefully have a debate in case you have comments or questions about what we said. I would also suggest that if questions come up, you can either send them in the chat box or take notes if you want to use the audio later. We will be reviewing the chat box after the presentation so that we can answer your questions. So without any other delay, let me share my screen and start presenting to you what we prepared for today. Okay, so as I said, we'll be focusing today on how the WTO has monitored the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then particularly how the WTO has made efforts, both the Secretariat and the members, of course, through the regular committees, the efforts that have been made to enhance transparency about some of the measures that have been taken to fight the pandemic. And the focus of today will be trade restricting measures. We will deal with trade facilitating measures on Friday in our session 2 for this module. I should also say, as a reminder, that we will be focusing on trade in goods. So the services and intellectual property components of the actions taken during the pandemic are not covered by this week's module. So to start, I think we should say a few words about what we know about the products that are relevant for the fight against the pandemic. And once we have identified those products, we can say a few words about the impact that the pandemic has had on world trade. From there, we will see what the role of the WTO was in monitoring both trade and the measures that have been taken to fight the pandemic through some of our regular bodies. And then we will finish with the illustration of export restrictions, as I said, and we will see how the restrictions that have been put in place, we will see how they evolved over the month and also what the rules are in this area. So what do we know about trade and the impact that COVID-19 has had on trade, and also how do we define the products that are relevant for the pandemic. I think the starting point for us to consider is that, of course, the WTO has a role in monitoring the statistics related to international trade, both import and export statistics. As you know, your governments make notifications of your import statistics to the WTO every year, and also your applied tariffs. So we have a natural mandate that didn't start, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a natural mandate in monitoring international trade statistics. But in the context of the pandemic, we faced a new problem that we hadn't faced at this scale before, and it is the difficulties in identifying the relevant products for two reasons. One, I think at least at the beginning of the pandemic, it was difficult to identify what products were going to be used. And once we had identified them, it was difficult to monitor how they were being traded, because many of them don't have a very clear HS code, a code under the harmonized system nomenclature. And the reason for this is that, of course, the HS nomenclature, as you know, is general, but even after the harmonized 6-digit codes, even at the national level, we usually don't have in national tariff nomenclatures, we don't have that level of granularity which would allow us to identify very specifically the products that were being traded. I can give you two examples. One is chemical components used in pharmaceuticals are identified by general codes, but then the actual substances and the items will use more specific codes in order to be identified, but not the HS code. And therefore, because trade statistics are gathered at the HS level, we sometimes don't have sufficient precision to identify those chemical components in international trade. Another example is face masks. If you take textile face masks, of course, this is a product, as you might imagine, that has been the trade of which has exploded over the past year. And there too, the HS code for face masks or face shields actually don't cover necessarily only medical masks of the type that we are using now. It can cover any type of face scarf or face cover. So identifying specifically these products through the HS code can be a challenge. And this is why we've been initiating a discussion with governments that it would be useful if governments themselves initiated a reflection about how to identify these products more specifically through their customs operations and national statistics, so that in the future we can have better visibility about these products. Despite these difficulties, though, and working with the HS nomenclature, as I said, we have had at least two lists of products that I'll be referring to. The first one you see here on screen is a WCO and WHO joint classification reference list for COVID-19 medical supplies. I have provided a link here in the presentation, so you can check what the list contains later. And I would say that, again, this is a list that was developed jointly by the World Customs Organization and the World Health Organization in order to identify COVID-related products through the HS system. But it's of course, it's a reference only. It's not a binding, any binding nomenclature, but it can be used as a reference by governments. And then we have provided some studies, research in the WTO, through the WTO Secretariat. And in that research, we have used lists, for instance, and I've linked, again, one of these studies containing an illustration of health-related products and COVID-related products. And we came up with this idea of this notion of critical medical products needed to fight the pandemic. And this, of course, contains hand sanitizer, soap, face masks, gloves, respirators and other hospital machines, oxygen. So these products were identified on a priority basis during the pandemic, and we have used them in some of our studies. These products in particular account for about 1.5, 1.7% of world trade. So you can see that this is a significant share actually of world trade. Now, having identified these products, what can we note about the effect of the pandemic on international trade? Well, it's commonplace at this point, you know very well that global trade has really plummeted in 2020. The first quarter of the year and the second quarter of the year saw the steepest fall in international trade. What you see here are two curves comparing how trade in services and trade in goods have behaved since 2008. And you can see that trade in goods fell to almost 20% last year. But you can also see from the graph that we have started a recovery for trade in goods. However, despite the curve, despite global trade, merchandise trade picking up towards the end of the year, you can see there that it's still under the baseline and it's still below 2019 levels. So despite an initial recovery, we are still below global trade that was observed in 2019. And that, of course, is also different from regions. We know that some regions have picked up more quickly than others. Now, despite that drop in international trade, I think it would be important for us to recognize that international trade continued to play a central role in delivering the products that are needed and that were needed to fight the pandemic. And the reason for this is that the very vast majority of WTO members are net importers of health-related products. With few exceptions, maybe 8 or 9 WTO members, all others are net importers of health-related products. And therefore, the majority of WTO members rely on international markets to access the goods that they need to run their health systems. This was true before the pandemic, but it became, of course, more acute and more visible with the pandemic. So medical goods, despite the overall drop in international trade and the shock in demand and the shock in supply that we saw, despite that, we saw an increase of at least 16% on medical goods in trade in international goods to reach, as you see there, $1.2 billion in value. And a few products, of course, stand out. We will speak a little bit about protective equipment, face masks, hand sanitizer, but two items that I'd like already to highlight about the increase in trade in these products is, one, China really rose as a main exporter of these goods, and particularly face masks and other COVID-related products. It's not that other governments, other countries stopped producing or stopped trading these goods, but China really increased its production to such an extent that it now became the first exporter of COVID-19 critical medical products. And as we will see, for instance, the case of face masks is quite illustrative of that trend. However, China doesn't exist and production in China doesn't exist in isolation. So production in China also pull intermediary components from other countries. And in the case, for instance, of non-woven fabric masks, China became the first exporter of these goods, but they use components which are mainly sourced in Japan and in the United States as well. So you see that even for those products, we have a regional or a global value chain that is relevant to explain increase in trading these products. The second pattern I'd like to mention about trade in medical goods is tariffs. Despite the pandemic, we see that many governments still apply tariffs on these goods. The world average applied tariff for facial, for instance, as you see here, was 8.5% last year. And in the case of textiles masks even higher. Now, a question that we should be asking ourselves, of course, is why do we apply tariffs for these goods? Because we know that tariffs are passed on to importers and to consumers, and therefore they make more expensive health treatment, and they make more onerous running national health systems. Now, despite that observation, we know also that some countries have taken temporary measures exempting some of these products from import tariffs during 2020. We will mention some of these measures on Friday, but in general, irrespective of the pandemic, I think a reflection might be, why do we need tariff on some of these products when we know that they make more onerous and less accessible health products? Now, I said that during 2020, one of the very clear patterns that we saw was a global fall, a fall in global merchandise trade, but a rise in trade in medical goods. And I think the best example for this is the rise in personal protective products. So facial masks, facial shields, aprons, medical aprons, gloves, and so on. As you can see here, in 2019, personal protective products were the third or fourth largest product category within medical goods. But in 2020, personal protective products rose to become the second largest category, most traded category in medical goods. As you see on the right-hand side, medicines continue to remain the largest segment in the trade of medical goods by value. A little bit over half of all medical goods traded are medicines. And this is not only final pharmaceutical products, but also the components, the chemical components that are used to produce pharmaceuticals. But then you see here, personal protective products with facial masks, the value of which has really increased, and this is not a surprise. You can also see that the overall trade of these products has increased quite significantly, from about 1 billion in 2019 to almost 1.2 billion in 2020. And I imagine that this trend will continue at least in 2021. So you see here that there was a very steep increase in this type of products. You can find more detailed statistics about trade in these products in a Secretariat note that was prepared and last updated in 2020, and the link of which appears here at the bottom of the slide. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, how is trade distributed in these products? And I think there are two patterns that we can highlight. The first one, as I said, of course, is that China really rose as the main exporter of health-related products, and particularly PPEs. You can see here in the first row how the value of exports from China rose. You see here an increase of 200% from 2019 to 2020 on medical goods from China. But you will note there too that other exporters have continued to export, either have seen a very little drop in their exports, or have also seen an increase in their exports. Malaysia being a good example here, number 9 in the top rows, you see an increase of 16% in exports from Malaysia of medical goods. So it's not that other markets have stopped or decreased their export of these goods, but it's rather that China really was able to pick up production to become a major exporter of these goods. And this is probably to do also with the fact that China was the first country to open partially the lockdowns that had been put in place in the beginning of the year, and therefore could reorganize its production faster than other markets. As you see on the bottom rows there, these are the main importers of medical goods, and you see the United States is the main importer, Germany, but China is the third main importer there too. And in fact, if we compare the top 20 exporters and the top 20 importers, you will find that there's a lot of communality there. Many of the main exporters are also top importers. And what this is telling us, again, is that they're interdependent. So there are global and regional value chains making production connected. But the other thing that this is telling us is that we also need to look into greater details to see perhaps China is a main exporter in one category, but the main importer in another category. And the same is true of other markets as well. So there's a lot of interconnection in these products. Now, having given you an overview of trading these products, what I'd like us to move now on to is how the WTO has monitored the measures, the temporary and the measures that were taken in the context of the pandemic. And for this, I would like to now give an opportunity to Roy to continue with this presentation. Roy, if you want to pick up.
Sorry, I had a problem with my microphone. Just to pick up from what Darlan was saying, let me now continue discussing. But before I do that, I think it's important to understand also that when we were in March, April last year, I think for most of us was a big surprise, right? There was a lot of uncertainty in terms of what was happening. And then in terms of uncertainty, once you're facing this, it's a very natural type of reaction to kind of panic. What is going on? Every day we're having one news which is actually worse than the next. What is going to happen? And just like us as normal people in our lives, we're having this type of feeling. Governments, which of course are led by people also having these feelings, had to take some form of action to react to prevent and deal with the pandemic. And then we had mainly three types of reactions or three types of trade-related measures that have been introduced to face the pandemic. As Darlan already hinted, some of the measures have aimed at actually making it easier to import some of these products. If you are a net importer and you desperately need more face masks, more respirators, more medical products, of course, the first reaction is you try to make it as easy as possible to get these products from the international markets. And we're going to be talking more about this on Friday. But then there was also an issue with respect to, let's say, the stock and the inventory of some of the products that you have domestically. For example, if I can give you one of the classic examples is the face masks. So it turns out we were learning that the disease was transmitted by air and droplets. And then we learned that the face masks were actually, let's say, a good form of at least preventing that the disease will be transmitted to the others. So it was evident at some point that we will all be needing lots and lots of face masks. But then the question for governments was, and how many do we have? It turns out in many countries, there was not really a very good system of inventory to know what exactly was the stock of many of these products. So of course, in the absence of good information, first reactions, you assume the worst, and then you need to make sure you have enough for your population. So lots of trade restrictions were introduced in this respect. Also, because of the health measures and protocols that had to be introduced, many economic activities were heavily affected. Some of them were essential really for the economy and for the rest of the country to keep moving. So the question is, how do we make sure that these activities are not damaged permanently, right? So we're asking, for example, stores, restaurants, many of these important businesses to stop. We need to be able to help them to survive, because otherwise it's going to be a bigger problem afterwards. So there's also lots of subsidies, incentives, domestic support type of measures that have been introduced. Now, in the WTO context, we have many transparency provisions. Transparency means many different things. We have provisions for publication, notifications, inquiry points. Every agreement had lots of different measures. And transparency is always important, but in times of crisis, it's even more important. And then one interesting aspect has been how members have been using these requirements to put in place and give information to traders. So again, just like governments didn't know what was happening, traders didn't know what was happening. So it becomes very difficult for them to operate in these uncertain times. And if we are dependent on importing many of these products and generating dollars or euros or some other currency to be able to buy them, then we need to make sure that trade keeps working properly, right? So one of these transparency provisions, which is very important, has to do with the notifications, which is basically a situation where governments provide information to the other WTO members. This can be related to measures that are already in place or draft measures that are planned to be implemented at some point. So I'm going to be making reference to some of the main ones that have been discussed in the WTO, notified by members relating to COVID-19 measures. Now, you're probably wondering here, how do we know they are related to COVID-19? Well, because members, I think, were quite forthcoming in letting us know that they related to COVID-19. Now, another aspect that is perhaps interesting to note here is that besides the obligation to provide information, there were also many members that autonomously decided that it was good to provide more information than was actually requested by the agreements. So on top of the notifications, we have also received many communications by members providing information, for example, on these trade facilitating type of measures, elimination of taxes, etc., that we're going to be seeing on Friday. So it's a combination of obligations plus additional information provided by members. Now, it would be tempting to think that the WTO only depends on notifications for the information that we collect in the Secretariat, but this is not really correct. We also have a long-standing exercise, which is called the Trade Monitoring Report, or the Trade Monitoring Exercise, where we also collect information from other sources. And these other sources can either be members providing information on the measures maintained by other members, or just like you, we read the newspapers, we follow what's going on in many different places. So we collect a lot of that information as well. Now, we are not like other, let's say, organizations that can just go ahead and publish whatever they find on the internet. For the WTO, it's very important to make sure that the measures, whatever we report, actually exist and is verified with the members that are maintained that type of measures. So yes, we were collecting a lot of information on the internet, but then there's also a verification process that takes place with members where we basically tell them we found this, is this correct, does this exist? And if they say yes, then we take that information, becomes part of this exercise. The collection of all this information is then used for purposes of analysis. And then we had the trade monitoring report, which is a normal exercise that was done. We had special reports, and Darlan, Simon, and I are going to be making a lot of reference to these reports that were produced last year. And then they are also used in the context of, for example, the committee work. And this is something I'm going to come back in one moment. Now, one point I wanted to make here, which I think is very important, is that whatever comes through the notifications automatically goes into the trade monitoring exercise, but the opposite is not true. That means we do have quite a lot of information that was collected through the trade monitoring, that was verified by members, but that never really became a notification in the context of the committees. And this may pose some challenges, and I'm going to be telling you why in a few minutes. Now, in terms of how many, we receive about 318 communications. Of these, about 286 are notifications relating to goods type of measures. And I just wanted to give you a quick sense of what type of measures they are. So if we only look exclusively at the number of notifications, you can see that TBT and SPS type of measures by far are the most frequent that we have received, followed by, and this Simon is going to be talking in the third section about the notification on quantitative restrictions. But I think this number is perhaps a bit misleading. If we look more in terms of the members that have provided information in each of those sections, you see that the picture is slightly different. And here, for example, SPS is this area where we have received more members making notifications. This is, of course, because in some areas, one member has notified more than once. And this is actually quite good because that means they are providing more transparency. If I can give you one example, I think the champion of providing transparency and notifications in the TBT area for this issue is Brazil, that has provided something like 35 notifications. Again, very positive because that means we know very well what's happening in Brazil. If you look at this in terms of the, let's say, time period and the evolution of when this happened, you can see there was a first wave of notifications that came very quickly after the pandemic began. So April is really the time when many of you were beginning to be locked down in your countries. For us, it was also the time we were being locked down for the first time. So it was quite challenging for the Secretariat to deal with this onslaught of notifications while being at home, working with remotely and not necessarily having the tools to do it. But I think a lot has changed since then, right? There has been no second wave yet for the moment of notifications. If you see the issues, you can also see that the composition of what has been notified has been changing as well, which I think is quite natural as the pandemic evolves and the type of measures that members are implementing also evolves. Finally, just to come back to this issue of the committee work, notifications are the main building block on which the committees work and have discussions. And in the case of the 5 committees that have received most notifications in these areas, which is the Committee on Agriculture, Committee on Market Access, SPS, TBT, and Trade Facilitation, there are ongoing discussions with respect to these measures, whether we can learn best practices. There are sometimes in some situations proposals to have these discussions and so on and so forth. In some of these committees, they are also making use of the information in the trade monitoring report, but it's not the case of the others. So one of the main messages I want to leave you here is if you have implemented some of these measures and you have not notified them, please contact us in the Secretariat and then we will be able to assist you in preparing these notifications because they are going to become very important in terms of the ongoing discussions that are already taking place in many of these committees. Thank you, Darlan. I stop here and then I give the floor to Simon.
Okay, hello everybody. We'll now look a bit in more detail on export restrictions. We'll take a look on what are actually the WTO rules about export restrictions. We will look at how many of them are in place or have been in place over time, what kind of products are concerned by those restrictions, and also how those rules evolved over time. So when we talk about export restrictions at the WTO, we call them quantitative restrictions. So what do we mean by quantitative restrictions? Those are simply measures that limit the value or volume of imports or exports that are accepted at any given time. So that could be quotas, prohibitions, bans, restrictions, or any form of non-automatic licenses as well. And the basic rules regarding those quantitative restrictions are in GATT Article 11, which clearly states that in principle, all quantitative restrictions are prohibited unless they can be justified under a specific exception. So there's exceptions directly in Article 11, or also in GATT Articles 20 or GATT Articles 21. And those, so what is important to remember here, that those quantitative restrictions, imagine there's free trade of a given product. Whatever measure is now put in place that limits the amount from the free trade amount to a small amount, this can be considered a quantitative restriction. And so in general, every member of the WTO has those kind of restrictions in place. but there's always a necessary exception. So it's not a disguised form of protectionism to trade, because the only trade measure to protect domestic industries at the WTO are tariffs. You cannot install a quota or another trade restricting measure to protect domestic industries. So when we talk about those export restrictions in relation to COVID-19 that limit exports, that's a clear case of a quantitative restriction. So you might wonder, okay, those are in principle prohibited. Everybody puts them in place, or not everybody, but a lot of them. So how can they actually be justified at the WTO? So what we've seen most in relation to COVID-19 export restrictions is actually GATT Article 11 2A. And this article states that the provisions of paragraph 1 of Article 11 shall not extend to the following, that is, export prohibitions or restrictions that are temporarily applied to prevent or relieve critical shortages of foodstuffs or other products essential to the exporting contracting party. So you can clearly imagine that imagine in your country there's a shortage of face masks, and this is critical in order to fight the pandemic. Then you can say that this is a critical shortage of other products that are essential to the member. And hence Article 11.2a is used as a justification for a given export restriction measure. Another justification that we see often is Article 20b, which is the general exceptions. That this is a measure which is necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. So a measure that is really protecting human health. So in order to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. It is also important to know that remember, quantity restrictions in principle are not allowed at the WTO. We have those exceptions, which are, for example, to relieve critical shortages or are necessary to protect human health. But all WTO members, if they have those quantitative restrictions, they also need to inform other members about those measures in place. So they need to provide a notification of those measures to the WTO Secretariat, who then circulates it to all other members to provide transparency. So that's it a bit about the legal background about those export restrictions in place. So how many of those do we actually have? How many do we know? So it all depends a bit on the data source and how we count them. So there comes the trade monitoring exercise in place. And I'm putting this a bit older number from last year, November, because that's from their official report of the export restrictions that they put out there. So in their report, they count that there are 76 WTO members and about 10 other non-WTO members that have those kind of restrictions in place. That makes about 86 members. And here we count the EU 27 and the UK individually. When we then look, what are the numbers of quantitative restrictions that we've received? We see that only 51 members have until now submitted a QR notification. And there's a summary report also available on Docs Online at the WTO that shows exactly who those members are. So you can see that we have about 25 members that have those measures in place, but they have not yet submitted those QR notifications. We, the Secretariat, we are always there to support all members in providing those notifications. So if anybody of you feels that now that they see this, they would want to notify, please reach out to us and we're happy to support. What are some of the products that are concerned, that are covered for those products? The most restricted or prohibited products are face and eye protection. Then we have other protective garments. We have gloves, sanitizer, other pharmaceuticals. We also have quite some members that restrict the exports of foodstuffs. Then other medical devices such as ventilators, other supplies. Then also COVID-19 test kits, toilet paper even, and soap. And just to also talk once more about what's really the difference of prohibition and restriction. A prohibition is really a full ban on exports, and a restriction means that you can export, but it's only a limited amount, or you might be required a certain type of license, so it makes it more complicated to export. So what was one of the most recent products that also joined this list of export prohibitions and restrictions now? We're in a next phase of the pandemic now. So all the vaccinations have started in many places. So there's a new scramble for vaccines that is happening now. So the latest trend is that we've seen is that some members might require export licenses now on COVID-19 vaccines, for example. So how did those restrictions also evolve over time? And this graph here stops at about October, but from what we've seen, it kind of continues in this way. So we saw this really big peak in April of export restriction measures. So we could see that in like February, March, people realized that we're really dealing with a serious problem here. And then in March, April, members really started to restrict exports to try to tackle this pandemic. And 70% of those measures were introduced for 3 months or less. So as we've seen, Article 11.2a is really to relieve critical shortages. So meaning that those are temporary measures to relieve this critical shortage. And so they are put for 3 months or less. But then, as we all know, the pandemic has continued to move on and been around for quite some time, at least in many places in the world. And so quite many of those measures have either been extended or retained, or we don't really always know also about it. So for some of the measures, we know since when the measure is in place, but then we don't really know if it's still in place, if it has run out. So there is some lack of information that we have available on our side. And then, but we also see that some of the measures have been withdrawn, for example. So there were measures of restricting exports also from Australia, for example. But as we know, Australia is in a rather comfortable situation considering the pandemic, and so they have decided that they withdrew the measures on export restrictions. I'd like to stop here by providing another set of links that is in addition to the links you've received before. And we will share this presentation as soon as we stop the session for today. And then you'll be able to take a look at it yourself, check out the links, and see and look for more information there. So thank you for your attention. And we look forward to your questions and comments to any parts of the presentation, be it what is the trade in those products in general, what is the function of the WTO in providing transparency, what are the rules concerning those export restrictions, and how have those measures evolved over time.